Okay, I think we are on time. Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. Everybody, we are ready to restart with the second panel of this conference. This panel is about the interplay between the new legislation and sector-specific regulation in the European Union. I will chair the panel. I'm Pierluigi Parco. I'm the director of the Florence Competition Program. That is an interdisciplinary program in competition law and economics at the Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institutes. This is a program that focuses on organization of policy events, training and research in competition law and economics. And you can find information about our program in our website. Let me remind also that this program is the program that conducts entrance for judges. That is a 10 years old training that we do every year for European judges in competition law. As I say, our second section concerns the interplay between sector-specific regulation and Digital Markets Act proposals. Let me before starting, a couple of things that I want to tell to the participants. Please, we will try to give, after our speakers, as much space as possible to questions, but it's very important that you address all the questions to all attendees and panelists, so that everybody can see your questions. This avoids duplication and helps the circulation of ideas. Let me finally also thank some of the organizers, in particular Marco Botta, our professor at the UI, our colleague in the Florence Competition Program, and Elisabetta Spagnoli of the conference unit of the Robert Schuman Center for the major effort to organize this conference. Okay, our speakers today, our main speakers today is Professor Alexander Destrel. Alexander is a professor at the University of Namur and part-time professor at the European University Institute. Destrel is here because he has, for many reasons, but the most cogent is that he has co-authorized with Professor Larouche one of the expert reports concerning the new competition tool on behalf of the DG competition. In particular, the report about the relation between the new competition tool and sector-specific regulation. Let me say also present before we start our main commentators. That will be Professor Mario Siragusa. Mario Siragusa teaches competition law at the College of Europe. He's a well-known competition law practitioner both in Brussels and in Italy, and is currently senior counselor at Cleary Gottlieb. I think we have a very good panel here, and we hope, however, to have your contribution from the audience for the discussion. So let's get started. I think that Alexander Destrel should start telling us about his report, and starting from there, his ideas about the new competition tool and the relation with sectorial regulation. Alexander.
So thank you very much for the invitation and for organizing this seminar. So normally we would say how we are happy to be in Florence all together in the wonderful place of the EUI. We are all at home, but for good reason. But I hope we will meet as soon as it could be possible. So here what I want to do, as Pierluigi has said, is to present the main finding of one of the expert reports I wrote with Pierre Larouche from the University of Montreal, and then to finish with some reflection on the new development, let's say, regarding the NCT. So the first point is what are the relationship between what I call the broad NCT, so an NCT which would have applied horizontally to every sector of the economy, and sector regulation. That was our mandate in the report. And so we did not deal with what I will call later a narrow NCT, which seems to be now the direction that the Commission wants to take, which is an NCT focused only on the digital. So, and that's an important point. Oral findings that I will present here are not on the basis of not what is the NCT today or what could be the NCT in the Digital Market Act. So, and then we analyze for this broad NCT 4 main issues. The first one, and the most important one in a way is the systemic issue, and whether in fact having an NCT next to competition law and sector-specific regulation, because we have in many sectors already sector-specific regulation which are coming from EU law. We have that in most of the network industry, in financial industries, and so on. And so our main point is that in fact an NCT next to what we have already would be in a way normal, won't be a problem. Because, and that's what we try to explain in the report, if you take the broad view of EU economic regulation, you know, we don't have an opposition, a substitution in Europe between competition law and sector regulation. Those instruments, at least ideally, needs to be a complement. And so that would be an additional, let's say, complement in the toolbox, which could usefully, in fact, close the gap that you may have in competition law and also in sector regulation. So for us, you know, contrary to what some have claimed, provide that it is a complementary instrument and not a substitute instrument, we don't see any problem. If anything, that may be a way forward to close several gaps. So that's at the systemic level. Now, at the substantive level, that's the second question we address, which is regarding the methodology you will use in the different instruments to ensure that this complementarity I was just mentioned is achieved. We think that the NCT should be based on economic methodology, as it is the case for most of the competition law or sector regulation we have analyzed. Now, economic analysis, economic methodology do not mean antitrust methodology. I mean, we know that antitrust methodology is based on economic analysis, but I mean, you have other type of analysis which can be based on the inside of economic theory without, let's say, having the straitjacket of market definition, market power assessment, and theory of harm as we understand them in antitrust. So provided we have an economic analysis, we think that this complementary role that the NCT could play could be played usefully. Another thing which seems to us important is that the fundamental principles are in the hard law, so in the NCT instrument, and not left to guidelines or to soft law. So we think, because it's a new instrument and because it is, I mean, it needs to have some flexibility, but the main principle, so the trigger for intervention, the institutional design that has been presented before, should be in the hard law. The third question that we analyze, and which is always very complicated, the institutional question, because you have some rapport de force behind, and you know that everything which is related to institution is complicated in Europe or in member states. And so we think, again, to ensure this complementarity well, that we need to have a good cooperation between the Commission and the national regulatory authority, which are in charge in general of sector regulation. As we know, apart from the supervising of bank, of the systemic bank of the Eurozone, where we have a European regulatory authority, which is the ECB, for all the other sector-specific regulation, we don't have a European regulator, we just have national regulatory authorities, and for each of them in general, a network of those national authorities. And so this is why we call it a transversal cooperation, because it's a cooperation across instruments, across the NCT and sector regulation, and at different levels, because we have the Commission at the European level, which we thought should be the natural, let's say, authority in charge of the NCT, and the national regulatory authority. And there we follow a bit the different phase in the NCT proceedings that you can have that were presented this morning by Eike Schweitzer. And we see what could be the role of an NRA there, you know, and the first is the initiation of the NCT proceeding. And there we think that an NRA may refer a case to the Commission, saying, here I have a gap, I cannot intervene because my regulation do not allow me to intervene, so take place the case. And the example we gave in the paper is oligopoly in telecom. As we know, we have more and more tight oligopoly in telecom. We also know that it's very difficult to tackle with regulation, tacit collusion in telecom. And so therefore that could be a case where if an NRA thinks that there is a problem, but cannot address it, refer the case to the Commission. And this idea of having a regulatory authority referring a case to the NCT authority, that's what we observed also in the members in the countries which have already a market investigation system, like for instance the UK, where a sectoral regulator may refer to the CMA a case for a market investigation. Then the second step is, independently on how the case has been initiated, so either ex officio by the Commission or on referral by an NRA, it's the issue of information gathering, which is obviously key in this process. And there we think that if the NRA have several useful information, even confidential information that they have collected in the context of their own work, they should be able to share it with the Commission, provide, of course, that the confidentiality is respected. But we don't see any problem of, provided there is a legal basis organizing it. Of course, we don't see any problem in terms of fundamental right to organize this sharing of information. Then the third step, which is one of the most difficult and the most important, is the identification of a structural competition problem that the NCT is supposed to address. And here we think that the NRA or the EU level network of the different NRA, the 27 NRA, may give a non-binding opinion to the Commission, because they may have a view and an interesting view for this identification of the structural competition problem, because they know the sector very well normally. Okay, so we think that they should give an opinion. They should not take the lead on the case necessarily, but they should give an opinion. And the same is for the fourth step, which is the remedy design. Here again, we think that a non-binding opinion should be given or could be given by the NRA or the EU level network. Then the question is, but then who should implement that remedy? And here, it depends. If at the end of the day, we realize that given the problem and given the remedy, in fact, the NRA could solve it, so there is no regulatory gap, as we may have thought at the beginning, then we think that it's up to the NRA to act, okay? Because if they have the competence to do it, it should be them acting. And therefore, in fact, what the Commission should do is a recommendation for action to the NRA. If, on the other hand, which is probably the most often the case, which would be the most often the case, the NRA cannot act, then we think that indeed there is a regulatory gap, and therefore it would be useful that the NCT remedy close this gap. And finally, in terms of remedy monitoring, because we know that in general NRA are closer to the market and the asymmetry of information in general is lower at the national level than at the European level, we think that there should be a possibility for the Commission to delegate to the NRA the monitoring of the remedy. And in fact, this delegation of remedy monitoring to the NRA, this is something which already happened in antitrust. And we cite a famous Italian case where, in fact, in an Italian merger, the Telepiù merger, where which is an old merger, but where indeed the Commission decide the remedy under its merger control power, but then ask to the Italian authority, Telecom and Media Authority, to monitor the remedy. The last point we deal with, which is obviously one of the most controversial in terms of concurrency, we think that in fact the NCT could apply next to sector regulation, and we don't see a problem if the two are really incompatible, so lead to behavior which are incompatible. It's only in this case that you have a compatibility problem. And there we think that the NCT should prevail because it's a European instrument. And so you could think that the European interest is better taken into account compared to a national regulatory authority, which in general has more national perspective in mind. But we think that those conflicts between, let's say, NCT and sector regulation should be diffused as much as possible if the two instruments use common methodology, common economic methodology, and there is a strong cooperation, a transversal cooperation between the Commission and the NRA. Now, as we know, the Commission did not follow a recommendation for a broad NRA, for an horizontal NRA, and that's an interesting findings, because all the expert report went in a direction that the NCT should be horizontal, but the Commission seems to decide, we will see, but seems to think that no, it would be better to have a narrow NCT, so an NCT which will be limited to the digital market, and which will be included in the Digital Market Act that the Commission should propose next month. Now, so as I understand, but I may be wrong, and I'm not in the Commission, so I have not the latest information, but as I understand, the Digital Market Act will have two big pillars, one for large gatekeeper platform, which itself will have two sub-pillars, if you want, a prohibition and an obligation list, so those black list and white list, which will be there to guarantee competitive conduct and fair conduct, and then some tailor-made remedies, so the gray list, which may be there to ensure market contestability. Okay? And there really the focus will be on certain platform meeting certain criteria. And then next to that, you will have another pillar which will be applicable not to specific platform, but to specific market, which will be the digital market, which present a structural risk to competition. And one of the examples that the Commission mentioned in the inception impact assessment are the tipping market. Okay, and there you will have what's now the Commission call a market investigation, but which is a form of narrow NCT. Now, my view is, but of course it's preliminary view, and I didn't see the text, so I don't know if even the basis on which I am thinking is the right one. But I mean, of course, to have those kind of two pillar and three way, if you want, prohibition and obligation, tailor-made remedy, and market investigation, has the advantage of, going from the nouns issues where we have sufficient, let's say, practice and understanding of the pros and the cons of some behavior that could be in prohibition or in tailor-made remedy, to things we don't know yet, but may happen. And so the market investigation will be a way for us to understand better those issues and then to remedy. So clearly there is some value to have this market investigation in the DMA. But we also have to understand that there are some risks. First, it may be too much in the sense that you will have prohibition, gray list, and market investigation. You could imagine that you have to choose between the gray list and the market investigation. But I mean, to have both, it's quite a lot. Another risk is that it's very hybrid in the sense that the Digital Market Act, and this is something that needs to be well understood, it's not only about competition and market contestability, it's also about fairness. And so the question and about B2B fairness, and one thing which I think interesting is this trend that the European institutions have in developing B2B fairness rule next to the B2C fairness rule that we have in consumer protection. Now, the thing is that because we have that fairness objective, the question is how it fits with a market investigation tool, which tends to be focused on only competition and market contestability. We may have different, therefore, of approach and also difference of institution in the sense that the large gatekeeper platform may be a kind of regulatory authority doing it, or if it is the Commission, the regulatory department of the Commission, while the market investigation should be more the competition department of the Commission. So it's maybe too much, it may be too hybrid, and it's clearly very, very quick. I think this debate on the NCT is a very important debate, but I think it was done a bit quickly. And I mean, to me, it's as important as the market, as the merger review debate that we had, and you know how long it took to get to it. So I think maybe a bit more reflection would have been useful here. So basically, my takeaway is if we take the broad NCT, but that's not the direction that the Commission seems to follow, we think that it could be integrated very well into economic regulation, and it could be a complementary instrument, a useful complement, provide that it is based on common economic methodology, and provide that there a close cooperation between the Commission and the NRA is organized. if we go, as it seems to be the direction, for a narrow NCT, which will be within the Digital Market Act, clearly it has some opportunities, but it has also many risks. And I think all the issue then would be to try to mitigate as much as possible those different risks. Thank you very much.
Alex. Very nice. Thanks. I think I'll give immediately the floor to Mario for his comment.
Thank you, Pierluigi. Thank you, Alexander, for your introduction, and good afternoon to everybody. I will try to follow exactly your scheme, Alexander, in commenting on what you have said. Of course, I've read your excellent paper, and I have a number of ideas that I want to share with all of you. As you say, of course, indeed, there is complementarity between competition law and the sectorial regulation in general. Although I think you indicate in your paper that sectorial regulation may pursue economic objectives which are broader than competition law. Now they include, for instance, they may include consumer protection and data protection. So they don't overlap totally. And secondly, on the complementarity, I think there is, both sets of both competition law and regulation do have specific legal requirements and obligations. In case of competition law, of course, although the general rules tend to be very general, we have a vast case law which has identified a number of methodology which have to be followed, the behavior which may be deemed to be, problematic under the competition rules. And of course, it's based on a finding of a violation of such rules. Equally, regulation in a totally different way through legislative process, but does indicate specific rules which, of course, amount to specific obligations that the regulated entities have to follow. And there is an authority which may intervene in case those regulations are not followed and those obligations are not implemented. Now, the NCT, the new competition tool, seems to be somewhat in the middle, right? It's not based on a finding of infringements of competition rules on one hand, and on the other hand, it's not based on a specific regulatory indications of what can be done and what is, the principles which companies have to follow in the market, which is subject to the intervention of the Commission. So that seems to me leaves quite an extraordinary level of discretion to the Commission. I will come back to that later on, which I think raises a number of problems with respect to judicial control. So that's my first area of concern. Secondly, of course, as you have mentioned, the NCT should apply horizontally. In an event, should apply to close the gaps which exist either in competition law or in the sector regulation. I have read the excellent paper of Professor Motta, Professor Pates, but I question a little bit the assumption which has been put at the very beginning of the reflection on the new competition tool. I think that competition law has shown through the Commission jurisprudence, the EC Court of Justice, the various national authorities, vast case law which now we have, that the current framework does have quite a lot of flexibility. And that some of the alleged controversial new issues, for instance, raised also in the digital sector, have been subject to proceedings. Not all have been very efficient, you may say, I agree, but certainly they have exercised quite a lot of impact on those markets. And I think we have examples of, issues like pre-installations, tying, exclusivity requirements, most favored nation clause, which have been the subject of intervention by the competition authority. And I want to cite the very recent investigation that the Italian authority has started a few weeks ago against Google in a case which is access to big data, which are instrumental to display advertising. So even in that very much debated area, like access to the data, competition authorities are active and are applying competition rules. Also, the notion of dominant position seems to me, under the case law, is fairly flexible. It's not only the ability to exploit, but also the ability to exclude. And therefore, I think it does apply in a very different, structural markets, different structure of the markets, which do not have necessarily to have all the same characteristics. Finally, with respect to Article 101, the major problem seems to be the one of the how to cope with algorithms. But there too, I think that competition law can go a long way. There may be algorithms which are, of course, which facilitate collusion, in which case Article 101 certainly applies. There can be algorithms which are suggested by one third entity to all the market participants, in which case you can apply the hub and spoke theory, and again 101 can apply. And the only real issue is when algorithms are independently adopted by competitors in a different way, and it is not excluded that in that case price transparency can be favorable to competition and not necessarily lead to extra competitive prices. So I question whether we should reflect a little more on what is given for granted, the existence of important gaps in the enforcement of competition law. And the second comment that I have on that is to the extent that the gap is a regulatory one, to the extent that the gap is not a problem of the gap of the competition rules, but because of the sectorial regulation, why to have NCT and why not to amend the sector regulation? The Commission has already the possibility to have a sectorial inquiry, which they have made very often, generally followed by a lot of infringement cases, of individual infringement cases. But of course, those investigations can also result in indication given to the legislation to change the regulation. So that could be, maybe a more effective way to intervene without creating, without giving such a huge discretion to the Commission, because the basic difference between regulation and the NCT is that, of course, the regulation has to go through the democratic process of having a legislative approval, and we know how often these sectorial interventions have been, the result of a very delicate and very difficult political compromise between the member states. So you'd cut that out completely by giving the power to the Commission to intervene rather than go through the modification of the existing regulation, if indeed the regulation do have certain gaps. I now turn to your substantive analysis, in which you said that, of course, the new tool should be based on economic analysis with fundamentals in hard law. But you suggested that we should not, that the new tool should not be based on competition law methodology. So no relevant market definition, no definition of dominance, and so on. So that's a major difference. Again, we lack precise legal indications and legal determination of the power of intervention of the Commission under the new competition tool. But you'd say, well, the fundamentals should be in hard law. But what are the fundamentals that you have in mind? From your paper, I think that you are thinking about fundamentals to foster a sound economic analysis. But that's, of course, very different than fundamentals in law, which have to determine, precise cases in which, the NCT, the new tool can be applied. And I will come back again to that in talking about judicial review. If the discretionary power to use this economic analysis is left to the Commission without any legal boundaries, as it would be under the competition law methodology, as we know, it's very difficult for the EU judges to review this part of the decisions of the new competition tool, because by definition, those will be complex economic analysis. And as you know, the Court of Justice in general defer as a sort of deference to the Commission with respect to complex economic analysis. So we can anticipate that the judicial review will be extremely limited if indeed we are talking about a review which is based exclusively on economic analysis without legal boundaries. That's why I think we should, on the contrary, use competition methodology in the NCT, and at least pursue the suggestions which were made in the excellent paper of Professor Schweitzer. At the very least, we should have a list of examples of cases in which the NCT could apply, which could become a reference for everybody, and rather than leaving it completely discretionary and based only on sound economic analysis. I now come very quickly through the relationship between the NCT, the broad, and the sector-specific regulation. I think I basically agree with the structure that you have illustrated on how to relate between the Commission and the national regulatory authorities. I think the suggestions you make are absolutely, acceptable. I worry about the concurrent application of those systems. We have experienced in Italy, of course, the issues of the concurrent applications, for instance, of the Italian Antitrust Authority under the Consumer Protection Code and the sectorial regulation. This has developed in 10 years of litigation with number of cases in front of the Council of State, referrals to the Court of Justice, and we are still unclear as to how those concurrent applications may take place. So I think there is a very strong warning that I'm afraid that concurrent application will result in litigation and in a lot of problems. With respect to the narrow NCT, I agree with your position. Honestly, if indeed we are developing a specific regulation for the digital world, why do we need also the NCT? Let's do a good regulation. Let's do a regulation which does not have gaps, rather than doing a regulation which is somewhat insufficient, and then to add to that the NCT. I think it's an absurdity, and I don't think we'll go a long way with that. It is, I think, a real overkill. Also, there is the problem, what do the digital markets mean? What is the digital market today? Most of the industries have, at least in part, are going through the digitalization. So again, I can imagine a number of difficulties in determining the scope of application, even of this narrow new tool. Finally, on judicial control, which I think is the real serious problem in this proposal. As I said, I think there is a huge discretion which is given to the Commission. They can impose structural and behavioral remedies, not sanctions, but as we know, structural and behavioral remedies may have a more negative impact on the companies rather than sanctions. This without the need to establish dominance, without the need to establish an infringement of competition rules, based only on this displaying of systemic failure, or even also a threat to competition which has not even yet realized. There is no doubt, therefore, that we need appropriate procedural safeguards, as Professor Schweitzer has indicated in her paper. But again, I think judicial review will, in any event, if we go ahead with this proposal, remain very limited. One, because, as I said, being based on economic analysis, by definition, the European courts will defer to the Commission. So we know that the judicial review, unless there is a total change, as I have been arguing for years now, in the way in which the Court of Justice exercise its judicial review of that part of the decision. So what we will have? We will have only a review by the judge on the remedies. So on the remedies, yes, maybe at least on the basis of the principle of proportionality, we will have a serious judicial review. But again, the remedy, if it's immediately applicable, creates a huge already distortion of the working of the market. It may concern, may have negative effects. So if we really want to do that, I think the remedy should not take place and should not be implemented until it's vetted by the court. So I think that if indeed we want to give such a degree of discretion to the Commission, at least the remedy should be implemented only after it has been confirmed by the court. That's all I have to say for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. I will take questions from the audience, and I will ask a few questions myself. Let me first, however, come back to Alexandre, to allow him somehow to reply to some of Mario's comments, and also get this occasion, Alexandre, to really ask you about if this occasion, this discussion about the new competition tool in the way you have discussed with Pierre Larouche in your paper, is also, could be also an occasion to somehow reconsider this very large debate that we had for many years about the boundaries and the complementarity between competition law and sectorial regulation, particularly economic sectorial regulation, that are sometimes truly close in a sense. But I want also you to ask, if you want to some of Mario's comments, please.
Okay, thank you very much for all those comments. So I think there are three main issues in all what has been said by both of you. One is this issue of complement versus substitute, and this is also some of the questions which are in the chat. And yes, indeed, it may be a way to revisit a bit, as you said, Pierluigi, the relationship, the boundary and the relationship between sector regulation and antitrust. But we think, and that's what we try to say in our paper, is that contrary to the US, where very often the two instruments have been seen in opposition, not by every authors and so on, but I mean, clearly, there is more an idea of substitution in the US. If you see, for instance, the Trinco case in the US, if you compare the Trinco case with the Dutch Telecom case in Europe, which in Europe, it's much more seen as a complementary instrument. So we think, given the fact that in Europe, we see already a sector regulation and antitrust as complement, it's less of a problem to add, let's say, a new complement to the toolbox, if you want. Now, the point that Mario is making, and also in the chat, is to say, but I mean, if it is a complement, why to regulation, it may be better to have a good regulation instead of having a bad regulation and a good complement, if you could hope that the NCT is good, or a bad complement, which is even worse. No, the point is, I think there is, of course, there is some valid point there. But still, I can see an interest of having an NCT next to regulation for two reasons. One is because, as we know, and Mario, you have mentioned, regulation in particular in Europe is a very complex process, which very often there is a lot of lobbying. And therefore, maybe this regulation is not the best one because of the complexity and the lobbying. And so you could have then the NCT in a way correcting a bad law. Now, of course, it would be better to have a better law, but sometimes, you know, this is a fact of life that the law is not good. And so the question is, what do you do? Do you strive to have a better legislative process in the EU? This is clearly the first best, but maybe an NCT could be a second best. No, that's for in general. Specifically in the DMA, I still think, although I am a bit critical to have it in the DMA, but I still think a validity of having it in the sense that there is a lot of things we don't know yet in the digital environment. There is a lot of unknown, and an NCT or a market investigation, there may be a way to discover those things. So because clearly it is unknown, so we cannot have it in the law today, because otherwise, I mean, clearly the law will overshoot. But it is in a way to experiment there. So I can see a validity there. No, that leads me to my second point, which is a very important point that Mario mentioned, is the legitimacy point. Because it is true that by saying, okay, the legislative process is bad, so we ask to the Commission a sort of independent authority to correct it, we have a legitimacy issue, which is huge and which to me has not been sufficiently discussed. Because indeed, we may prefer to have a bad legislative process, but which is legitimate, than to say, okay, we have a bad legislative process, but we ask to an independent authority or so-called independent authority, because we know that the Commission is not totally independent, to correct kind of the legislative process. And there, indeed, there is a legitimacy point, which is very important. And then the third issue is the legal certainty, because Mario, you mentioned all the time that if you go to uncharted territory, you increase legal uncertainty or you decrease the predictability. That is true, but I think that's inevitable when you have a new tool. Now, what you have to do then is to be sure that the process of revealing and creating legal certainty happen in a respecting the due process and where all the interests of the stakeholder are heard. But I think if we think that antitrust methodology are incapable of addressing some issue, we need new methodology. And I think it's inevitable that you will have a learning phase. And the important thing is that this learning phase takes place well. But I mean, at the beginning of competition law, either we didn't have much. I mean, we had some provision in the treaty, and then those methodology, those case law were built from step to step, from case to case. So I think here it's in a way inevitable. No, what we have to do is to ensure that it happens in the best way. But I think it's inevitable that we will have, at the beginning at least, a bit more legal learning, I would say.
Yes, thank you, Alexander. Well, let me come back a second on the dimension of this reform. You both remember, Mario certainly remembers, when there was that discussion about enlarging the merger regulation, expanding it from dominance to significant lessening of competition. And at that time, that was a major discussion, the gap cases, and as had consequences in the reform. Why we cannot assume that we are in a situation in which some new problems are perceived and the competition, leave alone a second, the regulation side is perceived as not a complete solution. The present competition rules need some enlarging somehow. So my real question is, are we here looking at the regulatory problem or at the competition problem? And that's somehow a question that we should ask ourselves. Mario, maybe you want to...
No, you're absolutely right. I think Alexander in his paper talks both about a gap which could be in the regulation, or a gap which could be a gap in the competition rules, and a gap which in the regulation. I think most of the debate and most of the study tend to show gap in the competition, right? Application of competition rules. But on the basis of the complementarity between the two sets of laws, I think probably it's the instrument has been thought as coping with both types of gaps. But I would warn everybody that we have had similar debates in the past, right? We have had debates as to whether or not competition law should also have an industrial policy dimension. We have debates about what are the values of competition. We know we are in parallel to this discussion on the new tool. There is a broad discussion as to whether competition law should be broadened in order to take account of a number of other principles and other values and other interests. So I see, a lot of pressure put on our competition system, which after all has worked extremely well, which has been very resilient in the sense of the word, which has been able to adapt to huge changes in the markets in all these recent 50, 60 years. So I'm always a bit skeptical about all these needs to change our system, which has proved to function, which has become a model for international, which has been adopted in a number of other countries. And I think that as Simakis this morning mentioned, you know, if we start changing our system, what's going to happen internationally? All the system based on our system will probably follow on and adopt similar rules. But again, without, at least at the moment, we have a methodology which is the same, the basic rules which are the same internationally. And this has been the great success of EU law worldwide. If we start modifying it, we will create a need of modifications internationally, and I think we will lose our pivotal role, and I think we will create even more problems of obstacles to competing in other markets, to the extent that we introduce, you know, new limitations in our own market. So I really would invite everybody to reflect very much about, you know, changing the system, adopting something which is halfway between regulation and competition, and which does not have the great advantage of our system, which is a case-by-case approach, which I think is really the foundation for a just and equilibrated system. That's why, you know, I am very skeptical about all those, you know, in basic, you know, findings that there are all those gaps. Yes, there may be some gaps now because, as Alexander said, maybe we don't know those sectors so well, and we have there is an asymmetry of information, and the authorities should learn more and should become more, you know, conversant on those topics. That's what I would do before changing the system. Before changing the system, I would empower our authorities with more technical skills, with more knowledge of those issues, and I'm sure that competition rules are flexible enough, and the court in general has been supportive of an extensive application. They're not really, you know, blocked the Commission in finding original new ways in which Article 101 or 2 has been applied. And in your example of the major regulation, okay, there was a gap, yes, and there was a regulatory change. The major regulation was changed and the new standard was added. That was precisely what I was suggesting. If we think that there are gaps in the regulation, let's close those gaps through a regulatory intervention. But let's not say that regulation is subject to lobbying. Lobbying is part of the democratic process. I don't buy the argument that in order to reduce lobbying, we should avoid legislative intervention. I don't think this is a sound argument.
I see from the floor some questions that mention the issue of that this tool somehow is also trying to bring together some different issues, consumer protection, some element of fairness, and some from the floor say why we should trust this issue to be dealt by pieces in different pieces of regulation that don't work well together, while we have the occasion to somehow, as it looks like this instrument is proposing, to bring them under the unity of a common view. Why should leave this occasion? Alexander, what do you think about that?
Yes, yes, of course, that's a very important question. No, I mean, for me, I prefer to focus on what the Nobel Prize of Economics Tinbergen says once, one instrument, one rule. Because, you know, if you have too many objectives in the same instrument, then in a way, it's first very difficult for a court to review what has been done, because there is always a possibility to justify your decision through one of the objectives. And then it means that you leave to the authority to decide many trade-offs without necessarily expliciting those. So I would prefer to have different instruments and then indeed organize a way to coordinate the authority which are in charge of those different instruments, to coordinate those authority well, which is not done at this stage. Instead of, you know, having everyone in one instrument, everyone in one authority, and all those trade-offs seems to, I mean, will be decided in an untransparent way, and it would be much much more difficult for a court to control over that. So I see the need to have a kind of coherence view. I myself organize this digital clearing house, which aim to organize a better dialogue between antitrust authority, consumer protection authority, and data protection authority. So I think that is important, but I would not go as far as saying, okay, let's put everything in one legal instrument and give it to one authority.
Let me add another consideration. I understand the debate about that you have done, particularly with Arush very well in your paper about the discussion of a broad versus a narrow instrument and moving for a broad instrument. However, I'm a bit torn in this because I see from one point the beauty of a broader instrument because it's better for the many reasons you explained. However, it seems to me that this problem, this discussion was born because of the digital platforms, because of the big tech problems perceived by the commission, by the regulators, in the discussion. So there is a bit of focusing in facing with a broad, with a narrow instrument the issue, or is impossible because the digital is so large, so pervasive that this is a red herring, that it's a mistake because you cannot really focus the point. I would ask both of you on this. First, Alexander, maybe.
Okay, alors, two points. So first, it's true that the main impetus behind the NCT is the digital economy or the digital market, whatever they are. And there I agree with Mario that they are very difficult to determine which they are. But there were also other considerations. I think there was also the consideration of an increased concentration in the industry, of a multiplication of oligopolistic market. And we know that oligopoly and competition law, I mean, it's not always easy. So I think it was not only driven by digital market. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, then our main argument in the paper is that if you do a kind of sectoral instrument, you will have a lot of discussion to decide what is digital and what is not. And Pierluigi, as you just said, now everything become digital, and we don't want this process to be drawn into legal classification and a lot of discussion whether you are in or whether you are out. That's the first thing. Now, given the fact that the Commission seems to have decided that it goes only to digital, my question I have for the Commission would be, but how would you combine a grey list and an NCT? Because the thing is that I understand that there is a need to have an instrument to learn a little bit better, but I think the grey list may be enough. You don't need, I think, grey list and NCT. So for me, given the direction that has been taken, I would choose between one or the other, but not having both.
On this point, I fully agree with Alexander. I don't see, either we do not have such an approach at all, or we should have it horizontally. But Alexander said rightly that it's true that digital was the main center of the debate, but that there were also other considerations, concentrations on the oligopoly. Well, but for that we have a major regulation, and I always thought that the Commission has developed in the years an approach to major regulation, which I don't think is the correct one. It has approved almost any merger because of this detailed analysis and narrow market definition approach which follows, and which then results in disposing of certain activities and getting the merger through. I think that this has been the problem. I have always advocated a different approach to merger control, which looks more at the market structure, exactly, and avoiding therefore too much concentration. We have the tool exists. It's a question of choosing an enforcement policy. I think that the enforcement policy that the Commission has followed is not necessarily the best one. And again, I would rely much more on the merger review process rather than creating yet a new tool to solve a structural problem.
Alexander, you want to add something?
Yes. No, Mario, I want to ask you one question, if I may. Is your point to say, okay, we don't need to have the NCT because, in fact, antitrust methodology are flexible enough, but we need to change antitrust methodology, because your point here that you made is very important. Because yes, indeed, in fact, you could achieve the NCT goal by changing the antitrust methodology, but maybe in such a important way that the court will not follow. And I think that's also a bit the dilemma where we are, because you say, okay, the Commission did not took enough market structure into account in the merger control, but and that's a real question. And do you think the court would have allowed that or not?
Historically, I think that we have seen many changes in the methodology in which antitrust law has been applied. If you think the big changes between concentrating on vertical issues, then they sort of were out of fashion, and now the Commission went back. So there have been a number of examples, how to consider corporate group, parental liability. We have seen a number of innovations which have been made in the way in which antitrust methodology has developed. So, and generally, I don't found the court to be to be an obstacle to develop. Of course, you have to develop them in a very cogent and very well researched and very with strong foundation. But I think the Commission has been able to develop, and our rules are broad enough, are general enough, that can be subject to different interpretation and evolution. And so we have an extraordinary flexible approach. Of course, you have to use it well. And sometimes I think it has not been used well. And that's the real problem. So rather than rushing immediately, also, I agree with you, I don't understand this rush. This idea of adopting a new legislation in few months and to do that without the proper. Of course, your papers are excellent and are a good basis to starting a serious review of those matters. But I would expect a much more broad and comprehensive review of those issues before adopting the new legislation. And so combining, a dynamic evolution of our competition rules together maybe with important sectorial interventions in certain regulatory aspects could be a way. And let's not forget, Ginevra Bruzzoni in a recent conference was reminding everybody that the Commission has already a very important tool, Article 106, third paragraph of the directives. So again, why don't we use that tool as historically has been used by the Commission? So we have a number of different weapons. But of course, we need a strong and unified policy of implementation of all of that. And I don't understand this rush to new legislation, honestly.
Let me go back to another issue very quickly. I understand also from the discussion of Alexander that the idea is that this instrument will be used essentially by the Commission. Okay, the first question is, brings us back to a period in which the Commission was the main case handler. And this is still true in mergers, but not in most of the rest of the antitrust enforcement in Europe. So is this realistic? And also, is this a way in which the Commission will act, DG Competition will act alone, or will have to act in strict cooperation with other sectoral DGs? Are we going to see a change in this, in the way in which the Commission works in these competition cases? Alexander, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I think if we go in the direction of of a broad NCT, as we say in our report, yes, as you say, I mean, we need to reinforce the coordination between the NRA and the Commission, because I mean, this instrument, as it has been said by many, and also in the chart, is an hybrid instrument between regulation and antitrust. So clearly, I mean, if we had a broad instrument, we would need a stronger cooperation, and we have come with some idea, and I think it could work relatively well. Although from my understanding, in the UK, when it is a market investigation under the reference of a sector regulation or in a regulated sector, the cooperation is not always optimal, let's say, and we have seen that in some other country, like in South Africa, where it has been optimal sometimes and not in others. But I think it would be very key here that it works very well. Now, if we go to a narrow NCT, now the problem of coordination would be not between the Commission and the NRA, but within the Commission. Yeah. And I think it would be very, very important that the DG Comp and I don't know which kind of department will be in charge of the prohibition list, if it is the Commission in charge of it, but it will be very important that this cooperation works well. No, I mean, it may work well. For those who have done telecom, you may remember that at the beginning of the new telecom framework in 2002, there was a joint team between Com people and Connect people, which were working together in reviewing the decision of the NRA. So I think this cooperation has worked very well in the past and should absolutely be reinstalled if we go in the direction that we seem to be going with the DMA.
Let me be schematic on and a snap, and I ask a snap answer to both of you. If we go for a broad instrument, then we are adding something to the instrumentary, the tools of competition. But if we go for a narrow instrument, are we simply doing a piece more of regulation somehow? And so in the end will be, not only clearly, but particularly of who will follow the digital markets, DG Connect, for instance, together with the DG Com. Do you have this feeling?
If you ask me, yes, absolutely. I mean, if it is a broad instrument, it's more around a competition plus. If it is a narrow, it will be regulation plus. No, whether DG Com will be out of the game if it is a narrow, I don't think so.
No.
Well, I don't think it should be the case. Huh? I think they should be in.
Well, and certainly since Ms. Vestager has both the competence, right, this is not going to happen in the short run, but on the long term, then you can have the problem that you raised, Pierluigi. Now, of course, because of a role, presumably there will be tight coordination, I assume, right, between the two. But in the future, of course, things may change. Yes. Can I make a sort of another heretical consideration which is based also, and since I see that in the following panels there are people which are much more competent than me on the situation in the UK, because the UK has often been cited as the example of those type of tools. But let me make a sort of heretical statement. But was that because at the same time the implementation of competition rules in the UK historically has not been very strong, or not? Or am I mistaken that indeed that tool was a tool which in a sense was replacing a weak enforcement of the competition rules, certainly in the previous regime before the UK adopted the same rules as the EU ones, right? So in which it approached the system more analogous to our own continental system, but maybe also after. Again, this is based also on my ignorance, so I don't want to I launched this as maybe something that my illustrious UK colleagues can consider if they wish in the future panels.
Let me say that we take this and we'll pass to the next panels. I think that the CMA experience will be discussed somehow in the next panels. And however, I think we touched quite deeply for what it was possible on the relation between regulation and competition, the limits, the risks, the opportunities, the possibility of this new instrument. Let me thank Alexander Lestrelle and Mario Siragusa. Thank you very much. And let me remind the audience that we will restart at 2:30 with the next panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye to everybody. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, Pierluigi.